We thought that it would be great stuff if we could discuss the budgets of the governments that were just elected, the Cook County and the state, without the political overtones of a campaign. Remember, politics and policy often go in opposite directions. So we have to hear an all-star cast of individuals who will be discussing this, making their presentations on the budgets of both. Give them around 5 minutes on each of them. Will be Ralph Martire from the Center of Tax and Budget Accountability. Raise your hand, give him a round. And Laurence Msall from the Civic Federation. I'm sure both of them have a lot of this stuff online, and I'm sure you could look it up afterwards and get if you really want to go into detail. Commenting on their presentations will be Greg Hinz from Cranes, and my old buddy Laura Washington from the Woods Fund of Chicago, and of course the Chicago Sun-Times. So, the last piece of preliminary business on your desk, on your tables, you have the official question. Make sure it is neat and legible. Richard Johnson, the former professor at UIC, I think I know what you're going to say. Very neat. Remember, the model is, as Eddie said, the Christy Hefner model. If it's legible, it is read. It's as simple as that. So, in alphabetical order, Ralph, why don't you start off with a 10 minutes or so, split it up any way you like between the state of the state, and the state of the county. And Ms. Preckwinkle, we do not have any hemlock here, so when you hear all this, you know, the sun will come up tomorrow. All right. Go ahead, Ralph.
Well, we'll start with the state because it's usually good to start with good news, and unfortunately there is none there. So it'll make everything at the county sound so much better, Madam President-elect. You know, you've heard a lot of numbers, I think, in the media over the course of the last year about the size of the state's deficit being $13 billion. And that's actually an accurate number, and I just kind of want to run that down real quick and actually focus on what services get covered with that. So this year, fiscal year 2011, which just started on July 1st and will continue until June 30, Illinois started off with a couple of bills it had to pay before it could spend anything on appropriations for the current year. Those bills include $3.5 billion that it owes to its pension system, $6 billion in past due obligations left to providers from 2010 that we just haven't paid yet, have to pay this year, and about another $4.6 billion in debt service and debt repayments. So before the state could even spend a nickel on current year services, it had $14 billion in revenue needs. And then the General Assembly initially passed a budget of $26 billion and change for fiscal year 2011, bringing total revenue needs up to $40 billion. The bad news is we're only going to get about $21 billion in state-owned tax revenue, another 5.2 or 3 in federal revenue that's recurring. That's $26 billion and a half in revenue, $40 billion in revenue needs, $13.5 billion hole. When I was a kid, 13 was half of 26. That's a 50% deficit. That's pretty significant. It's pretty significant, especially when you think about what the general fund actually gets expended on. Over 9 out of $10 spent in the state's general fund goes to one of just 4 things: education, health care, human services, and public safety. So we really have a 50% budget deficit in funding those core 4 services. Now, even the somewhat math-challenged General Assembly realized that's too big of a hole to start with, so they requested that the governor make some cuts, and he did make some. This July and August, he announced $1.42 billion in cuts, bringing down appropriations for this year from just over $26 billion to $24.9, saving the state $1.4 in expenditures, but still leaving a hole of over 12. 12 was still half of 24, still a pretty big hole. So then they manufactured some one-time revenue to cover these obligations, and there's a couple of sources for that. And number one, they sold off the tobacco litigation proceeds. They securitized that. Now, I think you all remember a few years back, the states got together, sued the tobacco companies for their somewhat misleading marketing materials about the health risks associated with their products, won that suit, And under that suit, Illinois was receiving a recurring revenue stream of about $350 million a year that was going to continue for the next few years, no more. We sold that off for a one-time payment of $1.2 billion, which, of course, think about what that means for next year. You've got to replace the $1.2 billion in revenue plus the $350 million in lost revenue stream, so it creates a $1.5 billion hole next year. The second thing they did was create a tax amnesty program. It'll bring about $250 million into the state quicker than it would have otherwise been received. And the rated special funds, these are things for like affordable housing, open space, parks, special interests, rated those for about $1 billion. And then the federal government actually extended certain provisions of the ARA for enhanced Medicaid match and educational dollars that'll bring in about $550 million. So net, they found about $3 billion in one-time revenue that'll be there this year that won't be there next year, cutting the deficit to $9 billion and change, 38% of the general fund. That's where they stand today. Now, it's always a sort of a facile political argument to make that they ought to focus balancing the budget on cutting rather than raising taxes. And Lord knows tax is one of 2 3-letter words ending in X in the English language that really gets people excited. But the bottom line is there's truly no way to address the state's fiscal problems without a relatively significant tax increase. If you look at our spending levels overall, whether compared to a decade ago or going back to Governor Edgar's day, our expenditures on those core 4 services are less today than they were under Governor Edgar after you adjust for inflation and population growth. They're less than they were a decade ago. We rank 43rd among all the states in our expenditures through our general fund. And interestingly enough, we have the 5th largest population, 5th largest economy, and 13th greatest per capita income. So we're spending, at least at the state level, nowhere near meeting needs for a population. And, I think for decades, one of the biggest fallacies foisted upon the voting public here is that we could actually have public services and not pay for them. I think that's actually confirmed in the polling data. I mean, Southern Illinois University recently did a poll where they asked folks, hey, should the state solve its budget problems by raising taxes or cutting spending? And of course, over 50% of the folks said don't raise taxes, cut spending. And then an even bigger percentage said, by the way, don't cut education or healthcare or human services or public safety, 90% of the budget. So there's this disconnect, and I think it largely exists because we haven't had the political will to create sort of a tax system that will support any level of public expenditures, and it's time to get over that. So going forward, certainly they should identify anything that they're spending in the general fund that's not being used appropriately to provide one of those needed services. They're not going to find much there. And I would argue, since overall spending levels are so low and we're not meeting need anyway, that rather than cutting that expenditure altogether to save some money in the budget, they've already cut significantly. What they should do is restore some of the cuts they made, and particularly to human services. And I want to focus on the human services line of the budget for a second, because that's what always bears the brunt of cuts when you have a fiscal system that can't meet its obligations, and here's why. You have a political process. You don't have enough revenue to fund services. You're already spending 9 out of $10 on education, health, human services, and public safety. So, is your first option going to be to cut education? Probably not. Who here has a kid? Anybody in the room? You have a child? Hands down. Who here has ever been a kid? Anybody in the room? Ever? All right. So it's got somewhat universal political appeal. Healthcare. Who here has ever needed to see a doctor? Anybody in the room? All right. Somewhat universal political appeal. Public safety. Who here likes coming home to a safe street where there's not crime and drugs and gangs, right? Human services. Human services, 54% of it is mental health and developmental disabilities. You get up to 75% of it when you add in the Department on Aging, taking care of homebound seniors. Final 25% of human services, that's things like child care for single working parents, caring for abused and neglected children, providing domestic violence treatment and prevention, substance abuse, AIDS, that kind of thing. So human services will get cut, and here's why. Who here actually has a developmentally disabled adult living with them and their immediate family? And the answer is not many. Politicians get that. So if they're going to cut somewhere, they will cut on human services. The data bear that out. Since the year 2000, human service expenditures in Illinois after inflation are down by 28%.
Ralph, why don't you segue on over to the county because...
Segue over county. Well, okay, I'll just say the case. The county's actually a little better.
Oh, wait a minute, time out. Game change. Why don't you take a break? Let Mr. Msall do the state, and then we'll come back to you. We'll do the state, county.
Okay.
This is called a audible.
Okay.
Also,
So just to sort of finish that thought, being fiscally bankrupt at the state of Illinois has led us into the morally bankrupt decision of frequently balancing our budget on the backs of the most vulnerable people in Illinois, those with developmental disabilities, those with mental health problems, et cetera. And we've analyzed this and, to pay some of our outstanding obligations to keep our current services at their current low levels, we would need a tax increase in Illinois of about $7.8 billion. And we've got a suggestion for how to get there. But if you put that relatively large sounding number in context of the state economy, it no longer sounds that large. $7.8 billion represents less than 1.5% of all economic activity in Illinois. So it's a relatively minor tax increase in context of the state's economy. And if you look at all of our neighboring states, other than Missouri, which has pretty much the exact same state isolated tax burden as Illinois, if we had the state tax system of Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Wisconsin, we'd have anywhere from 11 to 16 billion more in revenue now. They're that much higher tax than us. So this wouldn't make us a high tax state even next to our neighboring states, but it would allow us to at least pay our bills and maintain relatively low expenditure levels on those four core services.
okay, Larry, I'm sure you're going to agree with everything that's just been said, so go right ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. And there is a lot that Ralph and I would agree on when we're looking at the state budget. I think the thing that everyone really needs to recognize is that the financial condition of the state of Illinois is toxic. It's toxic in the most traditional sense. It's so dangerous that anything that it touches, it has a negative impact on. Our local governments are being dragged down by the state's financial crisis. Ralph mentioned some of the human service providers. They're being dragged down by the state's fiscal crisis. Our schools, our universities. In fact, there's now something recognized in the financial markets as the Illinois penalty. And that is a recognized term in the financial markets that puts an additional burden on any debt issued by any government entity or entity relying on the state of Illinois for a portion of its funding. Ralph and I could sharpen our pencils and figure out whether it's 13.3 or 12.8. Whatever it is, we agree on the magnitude of the deficit. That deficit was created by primarily one thing. That's the General Assembly appropriating and spending more money than it takes in. The General Assembly appropriated, as Ralph said, with the governor, about $25 billion. You take the $4 billion in transfers that go automatically to our local school districts and to our local units of government, as well as our debt service. You add the $4 billion in pension contributions that are owed this year, and then you add the $6.5 billion in unpaid bills. And you come up with, in our estimate, about a $12.3 billion deficit. The state's credit rating has been in an absolute free fall for about the last several years, but in particular the last two years. We're now only with California among all the 50 states that has a single A rating. To put that into context, states like Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, that have been hurt far more by the economic recession, their credit rating is higher because of how they dealt with the downturn in the economy. The estimates on terms of lost revenue for the state are very real. We lost about somewhere between $2 to $3 billion in revenue since the Great Recession began. But the state's spending has increased. It's okay to talk about state appropriations and cuts, and certainly Ralph is right that the human service community has been hit by these reductions in appropriations. but it's spending at the end of the day. It is things like the pension contributions. It is the debt service and the borrowing costs that are driving up the state's deficit. And those have to be considered as well. The state, I would definitely agree with Ralph, does not have a plan, doesn't have even an outline of a plan for how we're going to get through this and how we're going to stop hurting our most vulnerable and the governments that rely on it. While it's true that there have been significant cuts in appropriations, there's still no estimate that is out there for any sort of tax increase that can solve this budget crisis without severe implications to the economic climate. By that I mean you cannot pass a tax increase big enough to solve the state's financial problems. And as a result, most people recognize that we're going to have to reduce spending. We are going to have to change the pensions. We have to at least show a commitment to funding the pensions. Right now, the $4 billion that is owed to the pension funds this year is not in the state budget. The governor has proposed to borrow for that. They're going down to Springfield right now to look at additional borrowing. It's important to know just how expensive that borrowing is. Last year, the state of Illinois borrowed $3.5 billion to cover the one-year contribution to the pensions. That was a borrowing over 5 years. That cost us $800 million in this year's budget in terms of principal and interest payments. The new proposal that's on the table is that we don't have the money to make the debt service payment, so we're not going to make any payment on the principal until after we've paid off the 5-year loan that we have right now, the 5-year bonds. That cost of not making a principal payment till 2015 brings the total cost of that 1 year of pension contribution at over $1 billion. That's money the state doesn't have now, and it's not going to have then. It is completely intolerable and fiscally reckless that we continue to rely on borrowing and trying to push our bills off to the next year. The $6 billion, as Ralph pointed out, the $6.5 billion in unpaid bills is hurting the most vulnerable and jeopardizes not just the credit ratings of our local governments and our local schools, but it also is impacting whether we're going to have the safety network we do of people who provide services. They are incurring the expenses of the state's fiscal recklessness, caring for our most vulnerable, caring for our elderly, and not being paid by the state of Illinois. It just is completely intolerable. The only way that you can stabilize the state's finances is you have to be realistic in what your revenues are, what your revenue projections are, and what you're spending. Not just what you're appropriating, but what you're spending. You have to, in the Civic Federation's opinion, reduce spending by about $2.5 billion just to get started on framing the issue for what you can do with additional revenue. If you don't reform the pensions, if you don't change the state's commitment, excuse me, if you don't honor the state's commitment to funding the pensions, then you need to change the benefits. You need to, as Illinoisans, we need to basically recognize if we're not going to fund the pensions out of the operating budget, then we're going to have to tell the existing employees that the security that they're counting on and the promises that were made are not going to be there. That is going to require a much, much more serious effort than we've had down in Springfield. Only by a comprehensive plan that looks at your revenues, matches your expenditures to reasonable revenue forecasts, reforms the commitment to funding the pensions, reforms the commitment to paying your unpaid bills, can you stabilize the state's finances. Unfortunately, our Illinois General Assembly and the governor's administration have found it very difficult to focus on this issue. The worst thing you could say, when we were in school is, you didn't try. Well, there's very little evidence that the Illinois General Assembly tried once this Great Recession began to stabilize these state finances. We are constantly distracted with ideas of, let's focus on the capital budget, let's ignore the operating budget. The majority of the time when Governor Quinn first took office was spent building a capital budget on a very faulty foundation of video poker and some other minor revenue sources. The state cannot solve its problems by tax increases alone. It cannot solve its problems by gambling. The total revenue from casino gambling in the state of Illinois is about $400 million. If you love to gamble and you want to have more gambling statewide, you could double all the number of casinos we have, and that might generate another $400 million. Ralph and I are in agreement as to the magnitude of the problem being $13 billion. That's not going to get the job done. Borrowing for pensions, as I've already said, is enormously expensive and reckless. Finally, it's probably obvious at this point, there is no good news for the citizens of Illinois related to the state budget. We are going to have to face severe cuts in services and tax increases just to make up for the instability and the failure to address this problem when it first began. This problem did not, I should clarify, this problem did not begin with the Great Recession 3 years ago. This problem was created over decades of underfunding our pension and spending more than we took in. Thank you.
Well, now everybody is in a good mood. Let's go to the cheerier subject. By the way, you know what Ralph and what Laurence said. You know, those candidates for governor, this is exactly what they were saying. Just absolutely, you know, that debate we did with GTW, it's almost verbatim. That's called a humorous aside, or attempt at it, before we all start singing Closer to God Are We. Okay, now, Laurence, why don't you start off with the county, and Ms. Preckwinkle, get ready.
You don't want to have them, the commentators, talk about the state?
Oh, well, let's get you guys out of the way.
Okay.
We got a lot of people here with some of them are taking heart medicine, others have high blood pressure. Let's get it out of the way at one time, and then we can let Laura and Greg, you know, sugarcoat it a little bit.
I should have known when I wasn't at the head table what that meant.
Lawrence?
That I wasn't the mainliner. Okay.
Welcome to the City Club.
Exactly.
All right, go right ahead.
All righty. County government. And first off, certainly there's a lot of county officials here, and certainly want to extend our congratulations to all those that won in the recent election. First of all, in order to understand the county, and first of all, this is really a unique event. You can't usually get 300 people to focus on county government unless they do something crazy like hire their relatives or raise taxes. So thanks for all of you for...
Now you know why he was invited, right? Go ahead.
County government, it's a $3.1 billion total operating budget. It's got about 24,000 employees. Those employees and their benefits represent about 79% of the general operating budget. You have to understand what the county does, and sometimes it's lost on people. The Cook County government provides critical services in the area of health care and hospital services through the county health system. It operates really one of the largest judicial and court systems in the world. It also operates the jail and the law enforcement arm of the sheriff's office. And not insignificantly, it also operates the property tax collection system, the system of operating and taxing the 1.8 million parcels in Cook County. Those are all very important tasks, but they are carried out in a very outdated, outmoded, and inefficient structure. We have 11 separately elected county officials, all of which have a piece and a part or of those main four functions. In the area of property tax bill collection, you have the assessor, the clerk, the treasurer, the recorder of deeds, the auditor, all play an important, critical, but also independent role in the determination of property tax bills. That adds to a lot of inefficiency. The Civic Federation, a couple of weeks ago, issued a report which we shared with all the candidates for the county board and made available to the county board members that laid out our recommendations, our roadmap for modernizing county government. We said that one of the keys for the county to modernize is that it has to get its operational expenses in line. The county board, or the county's own financial statements, that is the existing county government, estimates their current budget deficit at about $280 million. It's probably north of $300 million if you add into it the elimination of the remainder of the 0.5% of the sales tax increase, and maybe more, depending on what numbers you're using. President-elect Preckwinkle really won't have a handle on that, and nor did we, until she actually gets control of county government, because the transparency, and that's really a big issue that all of us in Illinois and in Cook County should be aware of. Making sense of our government spending, the obligations that they're incurring, and just forecasting their budget and understanding their budget is very difficult, and it creates a lot of the problems that we deal with right now, that lack of transparency. So we think, in looking at Cook County government over many years, and the Civic Federation has been analyzing the county and most of the local governments in Cook County for decades, in the state of Illinois for about the last 7 or 8 years, their finances and tax issues. We believe the president of the county board does have the authority, does have the ability to exercise control over this government. Certainly it requires the cooperation of the other county elected officials, but they are basically all in this together. However, many of the county elected officials do not feel that they're all in it together when it comes to figuring out how to get the revenue to operate this government. That has to change. The sales tax, which many of you are aware of, the sales tax increase 2 years ago by 1%, was one of the least thought out and worst articulated public policies that we'd ever seen. Ralph had said that the biggest lie told to people is that they could have government without having to pay for it. I would say the 2 biggest lies that we see in Illinois are, one, that you can have a pension and not have to pay for it, whether it is the government that supports it or the employees who are relying on it, and 2, that you can raise taxes without having a plan for how you're going to spend it. The county did not have a plan when it raised the sales tax by 1%. It was billed as something that was going to stabilize our healthcare system, and basically the majority of that money new money did not go into the healthcare system. It went into retroactive pay raises and salaries of existing county employees. For that reason, we support the complete elimination of that sales tax. Professionalization is the key to getting control of the county's finances. We have to professionalize and modernize personnel. We can't have people in jobs for which the job description does not match their actual duties. We have to have qualified people in the areas of procurement and in technology. This county, it's estimated, purchase services and goods of almost $1 billion a year. It has to operate the most professional procurement system possible. Finally, there is the issue of the county serving as the municipal government for our unincorporated areas. Our report, and it's true, Paul, all of our reports are available at the Civic Federation website, civicfed.org. The report on the county and its modernization talks of, in one example, of the municipal services in unincorporated area. Most of us have been in Cook County for a long time. Most of the municipalities in Cook County have been here a long time. There's less than 100,000 people in Cook County right now that live in unincorporated areas. They do not have any municipal government. So the county steps in and provides, in a smattering and a spattering of areas in the whole, from the north to the south to the western portions of the county, police services, liquor control services, zoning control, animal control, and it's very expensive. There's no reason with a mature and developed county as Cook that we should be providing those services. It's in the tens of millions of dollars that could be saved just by asking those unincorporated areas to either pay the county back for those municipal functions or join with the adjoining municipalities that surround all of them and get their services that way. So that's my take on it.
Okay. This is big league, everybody. That's why we're going to go a little longer. So if you have to leave, we got to give everybody have a shot at this, because even the old professor just was going to respond, but showing incredible and uncharacteristic restraint. Martire, you're up. County.
Yeah, you know, the county is a very different animal than the state. So while we have been supporting a major revenue enhancement and tax policy reform at the state level for a number of years now that includes some tax fairness for low and moderate income families and some other things, expanding the base, et cetera, modernization, we have a different view of the county. So I testified against the 1% increase in the sales tax rate. I felt that it was way too high, wasn't justified, and for a lot of the reasons Laurence laid out. One of the major problems we have with analyzing the county government expenditures is the very lack of transparency he's talking about. We are assuming that there is probably somewhere between $50 to $150 million that the county can cut. We'd love to be able to help them find it, but you know, given the way things are reported now, awful hard to figure that out. If their actual hole is about $300 million, that's a 10% hole. Put that in sort of relative context to the state. The state's looking at a 50% budget hole. So the county's actually a lot better off fiscally. It's done some odd things. So you may not realize this, but the Cook County levy assessed against us that live here in Cook County, I'm a Cook County resident, has been held flat for about 18 years now. It hasn't been increased. It's lost about 28% of its value after inflation over that period of time. Its budget is pretty much 1/3 health care and 2/3 everything else, which is, you know, criminal justice, the court system, the assessor system, and the county clerk's office pretty much. Well, their costs for health care, if you believe the Congressional Budget Office, will continue to grow throughout the decade at about 7.5% per year. That's the projected annual growth in health care costs. So 1/3 of their budget, if they just keep their services constant, the cost will grow at 7.5%. The rest of their budget, and we did an historical analysis of it, grows at about 3.3% per year for just inflation and population growth. Their combined revenue sources, their fees, their different taxes, et cetera, grow at about 2.2% per year. So where they are doesn't work, but unlike the state, they haven't made the case that they've cut wasteful expenditures, that they've cut extraneous positions. It's not clear, although one of the reforms they did recently, that healthcare board, is a really good thing, and hopefully is going to modernize how they bill Medicaid, et cetera, and professionalize that operation. But they just haven't made enough of a case on the expenditure side to justify a revenue enhancement. So we testified against that at the county level, while we've been strongly in favor of it at the state level. We think they're two different animals. I mean, if you look at state government, we rank 49th out of the 50 states in number of state workers per capita. Our head count is 17,000 less today than it was in 1980 at the state level. I mean, there's been some very significant cuts made there consistently over time. That case just can't be made for Cook County. One word of caution for anyone coming into government at Cook County, and it involves your health care side. You know, under the federal stimulus bill, the ARA, we're getting enhanced Medicaid match right now, about 19% more than we normally get. Starting in fiscal year 2012, we're losing that. The feds aren't going to continue that. That will mean an overall cut in Medicaid transfers from the federal government down to Illinois of around $1.4 billion, a substantial portion of that flowing through to Cook County. So you're going to have some pretty significant revenue holes to fill at the county level, but I think to make the case that you should keep any of this sales tax increase that you've passed, you've really got to show you've done the job on the spending side, reduced extraneous headcount, and eliminated patronage positions that aren't necessary.
How about a round of applause for both these gentlemen? There'll be a short quiz afterwards, so keep your notes, but they'll have to be on the floor. Greg, we'll go alphabetical order. Greg, take around 5 minutes and tell these guys why they're wrong with their numbers.
Well, actually, I'm not going to quite do that, Paul. What I am going to do, though, is interject an unfortunate reality, and that's called political reality, into what these guys can do and what they can't do. Just briefly on the county, you want to give somebody some help in months to come. Give it to Tony Preckwinkle sneaking out the back door there.
Yeah. Why do you think she got elected?
Ms. Preckwinkle, if she's going to balance her budget, is going to have to pull off one of the most difficult tricks in politics, and that's to go after your own, because the cuts that she's going to have to make will very disproportionately affect either African American recipients of government services or African Americans who hold the jobs that deliver those services. That ain't going to be easy. And above and beyond that, if you think that sounds difficult, imagine the prospect of doing something else she needs to do, which is call together into one room David Orr and Gene Moore and Maria Pappas and Joe Barrios and say, guys, all your property tax functions that you all now do separately and have staff for, we're going to put them together in one agency, and 2 of you are going to go. Who wants to volunteer to leave?
Be a long meeting. Go ahead.
It ought to happen. Wish her luck. She's going to need it. In Springfield, you heard between Mr. Martire and Mr. Msall a great example of why there's a problem down there, with all respect. Ralph is saying we have a revenue problem, we don't have enough. And Laurence is saying we have a spending problem. We're spending too much. The reality is they're both probably right. And getting there in the middle in the Alice in Wonderland world that is...
Reverberation.
Okay.
Your mic's...
It's still reverberating.
Why don't you let him use yours, Rob?
Your mic's working.
There we go. Okay, thank you.
Professional meeting.
All right, and getting everybody together in the Alice in Wonderland world of Springfield to deal with those twin realities, revenue and cuts, is may frankly be impossible given the cast of characters you've got down there right now. Give you one example, pensions. The unions say, hey, our pension levels are not greatly more than they are in other states, and for the most part they're right. And hey, we've paid what we had to pay. You guys in the state haven't put in what you promised to put in, and they're right about that too. But there are certain benefits. I'd love to be able to retire at age 55 or 60 with full boat. I'd love to be able to get full health care paid for. That's part of the puzzle too. The state of Illinois can't go bankrupt, but the lawyers who know this stuff tell me that, could a state pension fund go bankrupt? If they're not bankrupt now officially yet, wait a few years. They're literally running, right now they're literally spending down their reserves. More money is going out than is coming in. And this is on top of the $75 billion in unfunded liabilities, at least, that they have. It's not pretty. Leadership is one of the great cliche words of politics. Everybody talks about you need leadership, and boy, do we need it in Illinois. But the truth is, we the people, just re-elected a governor who says, yeah, I want to increase taxes a little bit, but I think I want to use most of the money, or part of the money, or some of the money, depends when you ask Pat Quinn, to pay for more spending for education. Not to pay all those bills, but for new spending. Then you go to Mike Madigan, who's still the emperor of the Illinois House of Representatives. Survived the worst deluge of probably at least since Gingrich, and maybe before that. He's still Speaker. John Cullerton and the Democrats in the House passed a pretty big, and the Democrats in the Senate passed a pretty big tax increases over in the House, but Mike Madigan can't find his way to put enough Democrat votes to pass it out of the House. Why? Political reality. He's got a new map coming up. His people are going to have to run in different districts. He says, hey, we need Republican buy-in. But you go to the Republicans and they say, oh, we're not even going to talk about taxes or think about taxes until we get a bunch of cuts, which puts it back into Pat Quinn's lap, who says, hey, I already made the cuts. We need this new tax to pay for more education spending. So the three monkeys all point at each other. and it doesn't happen. The reality is that I'll play a relative optimist here. People have mentioned figures of $13 billion, $14, $15 billion hole. Yes, it is that big, but that is a cumulative hole. If you look at the hole on an annual basis, the structural deficit, what's coming in and what's going out in any one year, The real hole is probably in the $5 to $7 billion range. That's high, but it's not as high as $15 billion. It's potentially manageable if you can find a way to pay off the old debts and then restructure, recalibrate, cut new revenues to pay off, to fill the structural hole. I think some kind of tax increase is almost certainly coming on the way. I think some cuts of magnitude are almost certainly coming. I'd look, the Republicans keep talking about managed care and Medicaid, waste and fraud in Medicaid. I'm not sure how much is there to be found, but there's certainly going to have to be some. The unions are going to, I think, probably have to give more on the pension side. They don't want to, for the reasons I said before. But the political class has a nice lever if they choose to use it. It's called free retiree health care. They can end it tomorrow if they wanted to. It's not covered in the Constitution by anybody's definition. And certainly there's a new round of contract negotiations coming up in which ASME, for example, isn't going to be able to get the 4.5% increases it's been getting lately in the middle of this world's terrible recession. Even beyond that, I think you need to look at some really bold things that other states have started to look at that we haven't. Indiana, we all look down in Indiana. You know, it's a nice place. You don't have to use your headlights there. It glows in the night. Indiana managed to privatize its tollway. They managed to get a bunch of money and put it into infrastructure. Well, we've got a tollway which is not bringing in anywhere near the revenue it has, anywhere near the revenue it should bring in, because if you don't use a transponder, if you do use a transponder and you don't pay by cash, you're paying no more tolls than you're paid 35, 40 years ago. That's a great deal. I wish my gas bill hadn't gone up in 40 years, or my mortgage, or anything else. But the politicians don't want, in the suburbs, don't want to irritate the people in the suburban areas, so they won't raise the tolls. Well, you put the tollway in the hands of a private operator who can charge something closer to what you ought to have to pay to drive on the tollway, you'll get a wad of money. You can use that maybe to pay down pensions. You can use that maybe to provide a better revenue source for infrastructure than video poker. Another idea they're talking about in Springfield, we'll see how far it gets, privatizing the University of Illinois, something that has begun to happen little by little. If you look at how much the state provides as a share of their income, little by little, it's been going down. I'm not necessarily endorsing any of these ideas, but it's the kind of big thinking that's going to be needed, I think, to break this log jam down there, where everyone is acting only in the political interests of them and their political caucus, and nobody is looking at what's necessary for we the people as a whole to get something done.
All right, Laura, step right up.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm going to try to be relatively brief, because so I know we have a lot of questions out there. But I want to just talk a little bit about both political and human realities, and start by Paul by congratulating you and the City Club for even having this conversation. Because if you pick up the newspapers, if you watch television over the last few days, you would forget that we just had an election that was supposed to address all these issues. The only thing you would hear about, or mostly what you would hear about, is that we have a mayor's race. Now, there's a reason for that, and my good friend down here, John Barron, my boss, will tell you that people, at least in Chicago, are a lot more interested in the mayor's race right now than they're interested in hearing about fixing the problems in Springfield and in the county government that we already have, and that's just a human reality. There's a number of reasons for that. You know, the mayor's race is a lot more fun. There's a real contest going on, and it's easier to think about. There's no good news out there, as Laurence pointed out. People don't want to hear about bad news. We're talking numbers and budgets. We're talking about very complicated issues. You just heard some great presentations up here. This is a very complex problem. People's eyes glaze over. And unfortunately, the advocates, even including the folks at this table, have not been able to convince the public of how dire the situation is. You heard some real dire stuff here this afternoon, but it's not getting through. Another reason it's not getting through is just because after this last election, talk about toxic. This last election was extremely toxic, and it's left a really bad taste in voters' mouths. Voters are turned off by all the negative ads, by all the incredible amounts of money that were spent on ads and in these campaigns, record amounts of money, and their attitude is just throw all the bums out. People were in many ways voting against candidates rather than voting for candidates. Case in point, Governor Pat Quinn. He won by the skin of his teeth. He won by, at last count, something like 20,000 votes. That's out of 3.4 million cast in the state of Illinois. He won 3 counties. One of them was Cook County, fortunately for him, and because that had such a huge number of Democratic votes, it saw the day through for him. But many people were voting against, especially in Cook County and in the suburbs, were voting against Bill Brady rather than voting for Pat Quinn. Pat Quinn is perceived as well-meaning but indecisive, as Greg pointed out through a couple examples that he noted. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, Pat Quinn will tell you he's going in with a mandate. 20,000 votes. Doesn't look like a mandate to me. But so he's putting that argument forward, and obviously he doesn't have one, and the way he has continued to govern since he was elected, I think, shows that to be true. I just talked about the huge divide in terms of where the votes went. There was a commentary in the Peoria Journal-Star a week or so ago that the headline was, Let Chicago Secede from the Real Illinois. So many people downstate, and that's pretty much everybody outside the Chicago metropolitan area, is very unhappy with Chicago's dominance in state politics, so very much unhappy with Chicago's dominance and how much money it sucks up in the budget. And again, you don't have a positive political climate to make change. As has been pointed out by all the speakers, someone needs to take leadership and say that there's a lot of pain out there and that we're all going to have to share the pain. It's not going to just be about a tax increase. It's not going to just be about fixing the pensions problem. It's just not going to be just about cutting human services, cutting education. Everyone's going to have to share the pain, and no one is delivering that message, certainly not the governor or certainly not our legislative leaders. It's hard to do that, admittedly, when you're in an anti-tax environment, when you have so many folks campaigning on an anti-tax platform. Just this weekend, back to the mayor's race, Rahm Emanuel came out and called for no new taxes as part of his mayoral platform. People don't want to hear about taxes. In terms of who we listen to, I think, Greg, you're the one that said that Toni Preckwinkle is going to have to go after her own. Well, I think the same could be true for Pat Quinn. Pat Quinn probably won that election largely on the heels or thanks to African-American voters in Cook County. And that was thanks to a lot of effort that was made around the coordinated campaign that Toni Preckwinkle and State Representative Will Burns in particular ran. And there's going to be payback time. Those black elected officials and those black voters are going to expect something in return. And it's one of the things that they don't want to see in return are the huge cuts in human services and in education, which are real safety nets for African American voters. I'll just move over to the county just for a few minutes. I'm sorry Toni Preckwinkle left because I'd love to hear more of some of her solutions, but having followed her campaign pretty closely, I'll tell you that she's been talking and meeting and strategizing since almost day one, since she got the nomination quietly. She had a number of policy groups which she is now rolling into a transition team, and those policy groups were looking at every major issue county-wide, and we're spending a lot of time looking at the finances and trying to get their arms around and understand the policy implications of the budget process. She was working closely with folks who know where the bodies are buried, people who once worked for George Dunn, former Cook County Board President from long ago, and people who once worked with John Stroger. So she's going to be as prepared as anybody can be, but nobody's going to be prepared for the nightmare that's going to greet her when she hits that door. I heard her use a great phrase during the campaign where she said she will be fixing the plane while she's flying it. And it's going to be more than that. She's going to be fixing the plane, she's going to be flying it, and she's going to be throwing a lot of people out the back door while she's doing it. You probably read about that 5-minute meeting that she had with Todd Stroger. I think it was probably more like 10 minutes, but it's an indication of the difficulty she's had. She's been trying to, based on my reporting, I know she's been trying to get meetings talked to folks in the Stroger administration for months, and obviously she still hasn't been able to do that to help her make sense of the budget, to help her get her arms around the problems. In terms of throwing those folks off the plane, the Stroger appointees that she discussed in that 5-minute meeting with Stroger are going to be the easiest to remove because most of them I think will have enough sense, and some of them have already submitted their resignation and stepped down. But there are many folks in that friends and family plan, many of them who come from the 8th Ward, who have legally protected jobs that she's not going to be able to remove. And those are going to be hostile players in her new government. They're going to be working at every level of her government, and they're not going to necessarily be working to advance the cause of turning the county around. So those are just some of my reflections, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
How about a round of applause for both our commentators? All of you taxpayers who have to leave, that's good, as long as you're making money and contributing taxes. But we have a number of questions here, and it'll be real fast. Normally we end at 1:30. If with your permission, we'll go to 1:40, if that's okay. Because we got a juicy question that no one talked about, but 3 out of these questions all say the same thing. And I won't, Peter Skoski and others. Basically, it's, can the state afford the Ricketts request for, how many million to fix Wrigley Field?
No. And politically a terrible time to be asking for it, too.
Good discussion on that one. Okay, moving along. Boy, this one's unsigned. Normally I wouldn't read it, but it's really vicious, so this is good. To increase revenue, why don't we, I can't read that word, the penalty for doing business in Illinois, something about easing these, litigation torts, corruption tax, Cook County corruption and mismanagement, property tax system, high cost of public employees, could be a little discussion on that, and a few other things. Is the problem, someone said Cook County is 79%, the budget is 79% labor. Is it a employee problem? Is it a service problem? Is it a revenue problem? Or is it just a problem?
Yes, 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 and yes.
Thank you very much, Greg.
I was going to say that something that's often overlooked among those of us who really study the government budgets and their finances is the public's lack of confidence. And there is a large body of evidence that promotes the idea that new dollars being put into the government are not going to be spent differently unless you change that structure. So the public is very leery. You put the combination of the Great Recession and the public's lack of confidence in the front page stories of everyone from the governor on down, and there isn't a lot of political support in the public for big tax increases.
Although there are. I mean, just to be counterpoint on that a little bit, during a year when there was a Republican anti-tax landslide, I think I understand where Quinn got his mandate stuff, whether or not I agree with it. But interestingly enough, 2 of the 48 incumbents who voted for the bill you referenced, the big tax increase that passed the Senate, lost their seats on re-election, 2 of the 48. 7 of the 71 who took hard anti-tax stances as incumbents and voted against any tax increase lost their seats.
You're talking about Congress.
I'm talking about here in Illinois in the state legislature. So in the state, it was almost twice as bad from a percentage standpoint, small sample I'll admit, to be anti-tax than pro-tax this election. And if there is ever a year the Republicans in a state that's as blue as Illinois is, we're going to knock off a Democratic governor, it would be this year. A governor who came out pro-tax and who did not exactly do a great job, as Laurence and you and Greg all said, of instilling confidence. Yet he won. That is almost amazing. It certainly is counter to the national trends dramatically. How many governorships did the Republicans pick up?
A good chunk. I don't remember. I'm still trying to figure out what else.
I mean, I think what you see is the public does get it. And I'd like to, in addition to what Lauren said, we have, it's a very short report. It's only about 88 pages, but it's on our website.
What is your website?
ctbaonline.org that runs through historical spending and tax patterns in Illinois and puts everything in context for you. I really do encourage you to look at it. And the one thing that's really different between Cook County and the The state has made cuts. The state has demonstrated it's spending its money on the priorities we all expect. And those who argue that a large portion of the remaining deficit ought to be handled with cuts never get specific on the programs to be cut. That's because they know 9 out of $10 to be cut have to come from education, health, human services, and public safety, and people support those things. And in fact, cutting some of those things like education or stopping domestic violence and stuff creates more cost for taxpayers long term when you try to remediate the problems the loss of the service on the front end has. So the state's made a case, and a thoughtful tax change at the state level would be a positive. Cook County has not made the case. Cook County is a much different animal. It's got a far less transparent system, and probably far more needs to be done on cutting before it gains any confidence of taxpayers and voters on the revenue side.
Okay, two real quickies, boy. Wait till the next meeting when I answer all these questions. Whoever is speaking doesn't have a chance. Okay, here we go. Frank Paul, this is a good question, Frank, and we're going to get mixed answers here. Isn't there a constitutional requirement for a state balanced budget? Who enforces this requirement?
There is a state requirement for a balanced budget. There also is a series of rules that guarantee that every bill that's introduced will go through a process in which it's heard. Basically, it comes down to what the definition of balanced is, how you measure it. The state's use of lapse period spending, its refusal to recognize certain accrued liabilities make a strong constitutional requirement much less effective than it would otherwise be.
More political reality, answer this one. Ultimately, in a democracy, the final verdict comes from the people, the voters, who get to listen and decide whether to keep the people in or keep them not in. The voters this year picked a particular Republican candidate for governor. With half of DuPage County running against him, he won. They narrowly decided they didn't want him in November. They decided to pick a Democrat who said he was for a tax increase. Now everybody in Springfield's got to deal with that. Whether or not that meets the requirements of balancing the Constitution or not, that's what the people decided.
Yeah, it's got to be balanced for about the way they interpret it, about 1 second, as they add on debt and they count debt as revenue, believe it or not, in this process. And they do, Laurence mentioned lapse period spending. That just means you take bills due this year and kick them into next year, and magically you've reduced the amount of money you're spending this year and you've balanced your budget. It's really through classic chicanery, smoke and mirrors.
Actually, it's due to the fact that, unfortunately, many of our accountants in Springfield graduated from the University of Houdini. They're magicians. Remember with the Tribune people when we had Dawn Clark Netsch's warning about that $1.5 billion deficit in 1995. You're no Cassandra. Okay, we now, very much. Now we have from Roosevelt University, the lovely Demetra, out of the cuts made in the budget, how much is being cut for higher education? How will this affect students who rely on government grants?
Significantly, higher education funding right now in nominal dollars is back where it was in the mid-90s. In the last decade alone, after inflation and population, from 2000 to 2011, higher ed appropriations have been cut by 40% in Illinois. We've completely disinvested in higher education, driving up the cost of community colleges on up through the university system for low and moderate income families as the higher educational institutions have no option but to increase tuition and fees.
But that wouldn't lie. Okay, Joyce Saxon. I've asked this question to Mr. Martire twice. Here it comes again, Ralph. If neighboring Indiana does better, even though it has higher taxes, why?
They're saying
Good answer.
they have a predictable revenue system. They actually do a much better job of investing in infrastructure and education. And Greg mentioned the deal that they did on their tollway. Unlike the Illinois tollway, the Indiana tollway was losing money. It was a net revenue loser. And they found, I thought, a very creative way of spinning that out to the private sector and making money off of what was a net revenue loser. And that's how you solve problems. I mean, you get very creative and you do something really good in the public interest. When they got that money in the door, what did they do with it? Well, they created new capital assets. They didn't just fritter away on operating expenses. So, I mean, a sense of responsibility really would matter. By the way, if we had Illinois' Indiana's tax system, they take 2% more of personal income at the state level in taxes and fees than we do. That would mean $11 billion more in Illinois revenue at the general fund level.
We'd also have about 5,000 less units of local government if we had Indiana's system, which is something you need to consider when you're talking about where we fit in terms of tax effort and otherwise. We have an enormous amount of local governments, more than any other state, more than
We're
certainly
number
a lot
one
more.
by a mile, and that's our only thing we're number one with, so. Pennsylvania is falling further behind.
Paul, one PS on that. Again, both you guys are right. But one of the nuances that's gotten lost in this debate is Illinois really does have a rather antiquated taxing system relative to other states. There has needed to be discussion about a constitutional amendment to move to a graduated income tax. We're one of the few states that's got a flat tax. We have a very narrow base upon which the sales tax is allotted. It doesn't apply to services. Most states have moved in those directions. Those are big revenue generators, and unfortunately, in this debate over how much we've lost, how better.
And we had an opportunity to have that conversation on the local level during the county assessor's race, where one of the issues in that race was around upgrading the office operations, the way tax assessments were done. And you know what happened in that race? The candidate, the reform-oriented candidate that was talking about those issues got clobbered by the machine candidate who will probably maintain the status quo, so.
And all those great reforms Greg just mentioned, you could find online in our Funding Our Future report, where we lay it out how it has to be done. Please visit that site.
You could see why he's an adjunct professor at Roosevelt, that kind of, the modesty we teach. All right, last question. Of course, it has to come from Ms. Hefner, the Laurence Spivak of the City Club. That's only for you aging baby boomers. If you're young, I really don't care if you don't know who that was. Right, Father? I mean, the heck with him. I hate to say that. All right, here we go. This is from Christie. It would seem that the best use of proceeds from one-time sales of, like the tollway, etc., would be investments to drive economic growth. How would you suggest such proceeds be used?
Yeah, you do that on a case-by-case basis, and what you would want to do is, if you're giving up a capital asset, you want to create new capital assets, right? I mean, so that's the thing to do. The worst thing to do is to take assets from a privatization sale and use them to fund current operations. That's a loser game. It creates a funding cliff, and it's precisely what the city of Chicago did, right, with both its privatization of the Skyway and the parking meters, which have been so roundly applauded in sectors. So I mean, the thing that you do is you actually create a plan to develop new capital developing assets that can generate economic growth and business strength. I guess the only other thing that we would support, although we'd have to see how it would be done, is if they sold off an asset and retired long-term debt with it, like pension debt, et cetera, and but we would never support selling off a capital asset and using it for operating expenses. That's as irresponsible as you can be.
Unless something's changed, all of the money, whether it's tax increases, asset sales, are going to have to go into the pensions and the pension contributions. There's no way to stabilize the state's finances unless you address the pension in the crisis. And so really, you can talk about making strategic investments, but what's driving businesses and potentially people out of Illinois is the uncertainty of how we're going to fund these obligations going forward.
How about a big round of applause